Greetings, friends. I am Vitaly Portnikov. Azerbaijani parliament member Rasim Musabekov has called on Baku to actively arm Ukraine amid Russia's ongoing and aggressive energy war against Azerbaijan. The deputy noted that the Azerbaijani army still has a significant amount of Soviet equipment in service, which is being replaced by new Turkish-made hardware. In this regard, Azerbaijan could transfer Soviet-made equipment that its armed forces no longer need to Ukraine, which continues to fight against Russian aggression. Rasim Musabekov believes that there is no need to make any public statements regarding the transfer of weapons. As is well known, Russia does not respond to the language of public statements, but to the language of action. And that is precisely why it can be said that Azerbaijan should respond to the campaign that Russia is currently waging against its energy facilities on Ukrainian soil, not with statements and protests, but with real assistance to Ukraine. This statement by the Azerbaijani parliamentarian indicates growing irritation in Baku regarding the tactics that the Kremlin has chosen in its relations with Azerbaijan. It is likely that after the catastrophe involving the Azerbaijani passenger airliner, when President Ilham Aliyev called on the Russian side to apologize for the tragedy caused by a strike from the Russian air defense system, Baku expected a much more appropriate response. But the response turned out to be completely different. And as we can see, in Russia, Azerbaijan's desire to protect its own sovereignty is treated almost as an insult. And indeed, they do not limit themselves to statements, but take concrete steps intended to demonstrate their unwillingness to make any concessions whatsoever. Russia's energy war against Azerbaijan is the clearest example of how Russia plans to build relations with former Soviet republics in the future, and what lessons it has drawn from years of the Russian-Ukrainian war. The conclusion, in my opinion, is obvious and clear to everyone. It is precisely the use of force that is supposed to teach Russia's neighbors how they should build their relations with Moscow. In addition to the recent and significant strikes on Azerbaijani oil depots, which are specifically located on Ukrainian territory and belong to the prominent company SOCAR, there is now also the critical situation involving the Kremenchuk oil refinery that dramatically occurred last night. As is known, this refinery, which was attacked by Russian Shahed drones, also processed Azerbaijani oil. And therefore, the strike on the Kremenchuk oil refinery can quite reasonably be seen as part of the same pattern as the recent strikes on oil depots in the Odessa region. At the same time, Russia continues its attacks on Azerbaijanis living in the Russian Federation or on Russian citizens of Azerbaijani origin. Simultaneously, with the strikes on Azerbaijani energy infrastructure in Ukraine, it also became known about the decision to strip one of the leaders of the Azerbaijani diaspora in the Russian Federation of Russian citizenship. This is a completely unprecedented act, once again reminding us that a Russian passport is by no means a guarantee against any kind of persecution. Moreover, it can be taken away if relations between the two countries deteriorate. And it is abundantly clear that this is only the very first wave of significant repressions being carried out against businesses that are controlled by Azerbaijani citizens in the Russian Federation or by Russian citizens of Azerbaijani origin. Vladimir Putin is not actively seeking to make any definitive statements that would in any way precisely indicate his attitude toward the current political policy of Baku specifically. Moscow reacted calmly to the recent visit of Azerbaijani President Ilham Aliyev and Armenian Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan to Washington, as well as to their agreement on a transport corridor that is supposed to connect Azerbaijan with Nakhichevan and further with the Republic of Turkey. Calmly, at least in terms of official statements. However, in terms of their true and underlying intentions, we can also extensively discuss a comprehensive program of forceful and decisive actions. Therefore, it is likely that the Azerbaijani parliamentarian is right when he says that Azerbaijan could respond to Russian actions with corresponding measures of its own. After all, Azerbaijan should have been interested in protecting its own energy assets on Ukrainian territory, in safeguarding its own business, and in demonstrating its ability to defend its sovereignty. Of course, this will not change Russian policy, but on the other hand, it might deter Russian President Vladimir Putin from taking further forceful actions against Baku. We have already seen that in the Kremlin, The language of negotiations and diplomacy is perceived primarily as a sign of weakness and a willingness to seek compromises on Russian terms. We have also seen that the Russian leadership uses any negotiation process as a means of exerting pressure and gaining not only political but also economic advantages. But when it turns out that a particular country is ready not only to make statements and engage in negotiations, but also to respond to Russia in its own political language, the attitude towards such a state may well change. In the end, the president of Russia was unable to persuade his longtime political partner, the president of the Republic of Turkey, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, to stop supplying weapons to Ukraine, nor could he convince him to abandon his clear recognition of Ukraine's territorial integrity and Ukraine's status regarding the occupied and annexed Crimea. And so a rather simple question arises. Why should we believe that if one of the former Soviet republics, for example, Azerbaijan, decides to supply weapons to Ukraine, this would provoke any new reaction from the Russian Federation? After all, it's clear that if Moscow decides to launch a military operation against Azerbaijan, no arms supplies will influence that decision, since Azerbaijan is protected primarily by its relationship with Ankara and, by the way, by its new relationship with Washington, as well as the agreement reached between the President of Azerbaijan and the Prime Minister of Armenia. Yes, for now, in Baku, they're more likely to be sending signals to Moscow than making concrete decisions. But it's clear that if Russia does not stop and continues its energy war against Azerbaijan, sooner or later, Azerbaijani weapons will end up in the arsenal of the Ukrainian army. Thank you, friends. Stay on this channel, subscribe to it, subscribe to social networks, channels on Patreon, Buy Me a Coffee, and Donatello support resources. Use sponsorship feature on YouTube. Peace you all.